Well, I want to tell you that I wrote a new book, and it's coming out shortly. It's called the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God, retold in simplified English. It's a primer for people who are absolute beginners, who know nothing about the Gita. They don't know how to pronounce it. They have no background in Hindus, and we're going to have a free author event through Stepping Stones Bookstore where I can tell you about my process of creating this book because you feature it. The reason why I'm reading from an advanced copy that I have is because in this book I introduce a friend of mine. It goes like this. I had lunch recently with the rabbi who performed my wedding ceremony. I'm not Jewish, and neither is my spouse. And there's Kevin sitting in the front row there. We asked the rabbi, a close friend, to marry us because we couldn't imagine anyone else officiating our marriage. This rabbi has consistently spoken out for the oppressed, stands for social justice, and is an icon of authenticity in our community across faith traditions. If we were Jewish, he would be our rabbi. Yeah. At lunch, I was discussing the possibility of teaching a class with him about the spirituality of anger, supported by teachings from the Old Testament and New Testament. The rabbi interrupted me with feigned crossness and said, "Edward, there is no Old Testament. There is only the Testament." With the gentlest humor, he had pointed out my misconception. The whole world does not share the Christian perspective that I had been raised with. To the rabbi, his holy book had not been updated, renewed, or fulfilled by anything. Although we laughed it off, I grew that day in the awareness of how easy it is to misunderstand another culture's way. So when the rabbi called me up and said, "Edward, I see that you and your community are talking about protecting the vulnerable, and that is a Jewish biblical teaching. I'd like to speak." And I said, "Yes, sir." And so help me welcome Rabbi George Gittleman.
You don't believe everything that he says to you. It's great to be here. And it's really lovely to be in this community. You guys are really special, whether you know it or not. Now, a little over 3 years ago, that's a picture from Edward's wedding. It's Kevin's dad crying. I, was blessed to be their rabbi. I am your rabbi. What do you mean I'm not your rabbi? And I have to say, that wedding was one of the most meaningful experiences of my rabbinate. No hyperbole, really. And that's a significant statement for me because I've been a rabbi almost a quarter century. So I've actually asked myself, what was it that made that day so special? It helps that you guys are great. You come here seeking for meaning. You have great enthusiasm. And it's infectious. I love being here and teaching with you all, sharing with you all, because I get more back than I give out to you. So it helps that you guys are great. And that day, the place was totally full to capacity, and we did the wedding in the round in the middle there, and it was like a sporting event. I mean, the crowd's cheering. It was hard. You guys were hard to contain. It felt great. It was beautiful. And it also helps that Edward and I have been friends and colleagues for many years. Really, Edward is not just my friend, but my teacher, my mentor, and my confidant. And I'll call him in the middle of the night upset. And we talk about a range of subjects which I cannot share with you. And I'm also touched that Edward calls me rabbi as well. So those factors of connection and compatibility would have been enough to make for a wonderful day. But having been blessed with many such occasions over the years, I've pondered still what the secret sauce was that made it uber special. First, there is the personal vulnerability of Kevin and Edward. They are gay men, and Edward is a religious leader. And even in liberal Sonoma County, those two things alone would be enough for them not to have a public ceremony. Not to mention the fact that Edward is fundamentally a shy person. He really is. Hard to believe, but it's true. They could have declared their love and commitment to each other in a private ceremony, or even skipped the wedding altogether. Yet they decided to hang it all out here and have a public celebration. Their personal vulnerability was powerful, and it cracked our hearts open, connecting us to them and to each other. So I think their personal vulnerability was one of the keys to making a special day, but there's more. Over and above all that, the fact that they are a same-sex couple and are part of a vulnerable class of people, I think that was the thing that really made it special. For on that day, we remembered that just a little while ago, such a wedding would have been unthinkable. We remembered and felt the pain of generations of couples who had to hide their love and commitment for each other for fear of every kind of abuse. A few years earlier, I had married two women in their 80s who lived for 40 years as roommates. It was really touching. And when it came time for them to kiss, it's not such a Jewish thing at the end of weddings, but still, in America, at the end, you kiss. It was too much for them after all those years of being in the closet. So when Kevin and Edward got married, our hearts happily broke open, not only for them, but for all who had come before them, and our joy was mixed with tears. Remembering Kevin and Edward's wedding leads me to consider this morning's theme, protecting the vulnerable, a theme shared, I understand, centers across the country. So Judaism's concern for the vulnerable surfaces in the book of Exodus. Exodus, movement of Jah people. Oh, yeah. Bob Marley was a third world prophet. So Exodus is part of the Hebrew Bible, part of the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah, what many of you know as the Old Testament. You remember the story. Moses and God confront Pharaoh. Moses leads a revolution, basically, and includes the Israelites are enslaved for over 400 years. So Moses goes to Pharaoh. First, God says to Moses, go to Pharaoh. And Moses says, who am I to go to Pharaoh? But he convinces him to go to Pharaoh. And he goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go. And what does Pharaoh say? No. What does Pharaoh say? No. Okay. And the result of this is a number of plagues, 10. Then Pharaoh says, okay, go. And they go. And they get to the edge of the Sea of Reeds. And Pharaoh changes his mind and sends the army after them. And they're trapped there. The last minute, the sea opens. And they make it to the other side. And then they travel towards the Promised Land. And on their way, they get to a place called Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. And there they receive a revelation from God known as the Aseret Dibrot, the 10 Commandments. And right after those 10 comes more legislation. Important for creating a just society. And here's part of it. Exodus 22, chapter 20. Exodus chapter 22, verse 20 and 21. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It also says, you shall not abuse any widow or orphan, and you shall not take advantage of the poor. The vulnerable, according to this and many other passages in the Bible, are these categories: the stranger, the orphan, the widow, and the poor. And they're categories. They're concepts you understand that apply not just to someone who's called that person. I'll explain. Because with a little interpretation, to see that the folks who were vulnerable in ancient Israel are still vulnerable today. Because as much as things change, they stay the same. So some interpretations needed, but not much. For example, if you're poor, you're vulnerable. Always have been. Always will be. Do you realize that 1 in 3 households in Sonoma County live with food insecurity, miss a meal every day, go hungry every day. 1 in 3. So in this room right now, I'm sure there are people that miss a meal every day. 1 in 3. Orphans and widows are also still a vulnerable group, but in ancient Israel, they were especially prone to mistreatment because of the nature of tribal, patriarchal societies. You see, without the protection of the male hierarchy, you could easily be taken advantage of without recourse. Your man, the patriarch, would not be there to protect you. I'd like to say that's over. We're struggling right now with the patriarchy as women and their allies protest sexual harassment and fight to maintain their rights over their own bodies. What is happening to our country? I'm from the South, and I'm ashamed of what's happening in the South. I heard a health official in Missouri who was asked, well, what are women to do who need an abortion? Because they passed really restrictive laws. And he said, well, you can travel to another state. Talk about white privilege, male patriarchy. What about, his wife, his daughter can travel to another state, but if you're poor, if you're a person of color, you're struggling, you're not going to make it to another state. But of all the ancient vulnerable classes, the one Scripture is most concerned about is the stranger, the unfamiliar, deemed the dangerous other. The stranger of ancient Israel most easily translates to guest workers, resident aliens, immigrants, or refugees. Because like the orphan and widow, the stranger could not rely on the help of the patriarchy. They could also not seek shelter with a tribe or kin, a family, come from somewhere else. Worse yet, much of the rule of law did not apply to them, making them especially subject to mistreatment and abuse. So, just to make this real, if you come to this country from another country and you're undocumented, you don't enjoy the protections of someone who's a citizen. You can be abused at your workplace, and if you go to complain, your employer can say, I'll just have you deported. Okay? You don't have the same rights and privileges. Maybe you're saying you shouldn't, but you're vulnerable because of that. You're vulnerable because of that. Concern for the stranger was so great in ancient Israel that it's mentioned no less than 36 times. I'll just give you a few examples. You should not oppress a stranger, for you know the soul of the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Exodus 23:9. The stranger who resides with you shall beat you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Leviticus 19. You too must befriend the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That's from Deuteronomy. So Jewish tradition teaches me, I would say us, you're Jewish today. These are universal teachings. Teaches us to defend the rights of the stranger, which of course includes the LGBTQ community. See, we live in a bubble here, and we kind of think we won the war. It's all good now. We might need to rethink that. Being gay often means being robbed of the basic protective structures of society, including your own home, just like the stranger in ancient Israel, either because the laws don't exist or they're not enforced. So this is Gay Pride Month, and this is Gay Pride Weekend, and I think in Sonoma County we think of it as a celebration of diversity. It started after the riots in 1969 as protest. Okay, and I'd like to say we don't need to protest, but we do. We do for all kinds of reasons. Marriage equality wasn't just about having the right to have a religious ceremony. It's about the rights and privileges the law gives you if you're married. If you're a trans person today, do you feel safe? the current administration wants to roll back federal protections the Obama administration put in. We have to continue to work for all the vulnerable groups, including the queer community. We can't sit in this bubble and think, okay, we're done, because we're not. And the plight of the stranger, this concept, just as it applies to gay folk, to people on the move, also applies to a number of other groups as well, like the mentally ill. You know, if you're poor and you struggle with extreme mental illness, you're likely to end up not with a therapist, not in a therapeutic setting, but in jail. Our jails and prisons are full of mentally ill people, and really the only reason they're there is they didn't get the treatment that they needed. If you're homeless, you're clearly a vulnerable group like the stranger. And then, of course, people of color. I mean, Sonoma County is very white, and we're very much removed from the struggle of especially African Americans. But African Americans are so vulnerable in our society. I just read a book called Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. And he shows so clearly that you can go from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. And then he works in the South to try to free people who are wrongly accused and thrown on death row and various other places, including over 2,000 children, not on death row, but are at 13 sent to jail for the rest of their life. So all these groups are important. And it's also true that the Jewish community is especially sensitive to the plight of people on the move, immigrants and refugees. Having spent most of the last 2,000 years a persecuted stateless minority. I know it's hard to see Jewish people in this country as a vulnerable minority. We actually are. We actually are. America's been great for us. It's never been better. But this is an anomaly, a new thing for us. My grandparents, for example, fled a Europe aflame with unbridled nationalism and anti-Semitism. There was nothing new about this. Poverty, insecurity, and persecution were the almost daily story of the Jews of Europe for centuries, with few exceptions. Still, the upheaval of the early 20th century was exceptionally brutal. My maternal grandfather's family was in the lumber business in Austria, and after their mill was torched, they decided to head for America. They couldn't all come at once, so my grandfather was the oldest of 7 at 12 and a half. And so he made his way to Ellis Island, he made a living, and he brought everyone over. And his story is so common. Hundreds of thousands and later millions of Jews fled Europe, joining the mixed multitude of non-Jewish European immigrants, Russians, Poles, Italians, Germans, the Irish, and others. Many of your grandparents, right, came over at that time, all making their way to America. The numbers are staggering. Between 1880 and 1920, over 3 million Jews came to this country. And of course, they were the lucky ones, because everyone that stayed behind was murdered by the Nazis a few years later. In America, all these people merged with millions of others, the strangers of all kinds, with equally compelling stories. They brought with them little, but the yearning to be free, the yearning for safety, for prosperity, for peace. They had few bags, but they were weighed down with tsuras, with the burden, with the pain of what they fled. I imagine them on the boat into Ellis Island, packed, everyone up on the deck. The first sight of land, the rising flame of the Statue of Liberty. Keep ancient lands, your storied pomp. Wrote the Jewish poet Emma Lazarus in the poem inscribed on the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my hand beside the golden door. Yeah, it was us. And it's them, all these refugees coming from Latin America. Most of them are refugees. They need our help. We need a border too, but we need to see them as vulnerable, and we don't need to send the army down there, or we need to send medical aid, we need to send food, we need to send shelter down there. Clearly, immigrants of various kinds are the moral equivalent of the stranger. Equally clear is the moral mandate to come to their aid. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It's actually overwhelming to think about all the vulnerable people in society in need of our concern, our help, our care. I've used only a few to illustrate the many, with the hope that you will apply the idea in your own life and where your heart takes you. So now that we have a working definition of the vulnerable, I want to turn to the question, how are we to respond as people of faith, as a spiritual community? How can we respond in a way that is consistent with our beliefs and our desire to be people that are awake and alive, mindful? I know that many spiritual centers are anxious not to mix spiritual practice with social justice work, and I understand why. It can be polarizing and divisive, and I, for sure, in my own community, maybe even yours, have sometimes been that, and I'm sorry. I get it, but I ask you, what is the value of spiritual practice that does not lead to a kinder, more just, and compassionate world? I'm not used to clapping. Let's try this. May I have an amen? Amen. Always wanted to do that. So the first step is to take a step, to realize that spiritual practice includes, maybe even demands, social action. This is certainly the view of the Hebrew prophets who disdained religion devoid of morality. So I'm about to read from Isaiah, and we read this in the synagogue on the holiest day of the year called Yom Kippur when we fast. And so he's riffing off of fasting and talking about how you can fast all you want, but if you're not a good person, it won't matter. So Isaiah says, "Cry with a full throat without restraint. Raise your voice like a ram's horn. Declare to my people their transgression, to the house of Jacob their sin. To be sure, they seek me daily, eager to learn my ways. Like a nation that does what is right, that has not abandoned the laws of its God, they ask me for the right way. They are eager for the nearness of God. Why, they ask, when we fasted, did you not see? When we starved our bodies, did you not pay heed? Because on your fast day, you see to your business and oppress all your brothers and laborers. Because you fast in strife and contention, and you strike with a wicked fist. Your fasting today is not such as to make your voice heard on high. This is not the fast I want. What I want is to unlock fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. It is to share your bread with the hungry and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to clothe him and not to ignore your own kin. Then shall your light burst through like the dawn and your healing spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall march before you. The presence of God shall be your rear guard. Then when you call, Adonai will answer. When you cry, saying, Hineni, here I am. The question is not whether to act, but how to act. It is not what I should do, but from where will I draw my strength? From where will my intention, my spirit be directed? The great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. argued, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. He knew his stuff. Because I'll tell you what, I'm angry! Right? I'm angry. I get up every morning. Laura, my spouse, precedes me. I get into the kitchen. She's read the papers are there, the New York Times and the Press Democrat. We don't do TV, except for Warriors games. And so I get the paper, and, I read a couple lines, and my gut starts to tighten. And I start to say something to Laura, and she's like, just don't say it. So anger is a great motivator, but also toxic. The angry voice lies. I think of our current president and how much stomach lining I've lost, troubled over his actions and his words. And I ask myself, who does that bile in my belly benefit? It certainly doesn't touch him, and it doesn't help me. So I know anger. I have a little anger challenge in my life. And anger may be an appropriate motivator for some. But as Dr. King knew so well, love is a superior source for our work. I'm convinced, preached Dr. King, that love is the most durable power in the world. It is not an expression of impractical idealism, but of practical realism. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, love is an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. To return hate for hate does nothing but intensify the existence of evil in the universe. Someone must have sense enough and religion enough to cut off the chain of hate and evil, and this can only be done through love. He was a great preacher. When you see another person in need, our natural response, if our hearts are open, is to help. When you see a person in need and your heart's open, you want to help them. Keeping an open heart is the core work of any spiritual practice. And it's also hard, right? We have compassion fatigue. We're frightened. We're hurting ourselves. We want to go like this. But God wants us to. We need to go like this. So let's do this for a second. Go like this. And feel what it feels like to be like this. And then go like this. Notice the difference. Keeping an open heart is the core work of any spiritual practice. This is where the work of the center can be so helpful. It also brings us back to Kevin and Edward's wedding and the power of being personally vulnerable. Personal vulnerability is the key to most all of what we want in life. To connection, to meaning, to love, to social justice. Vulnerability is about courage, authenticity, and faith. Being vulnerable is being real, showing up, and not letting your fear rule over you. When we're vulnerable, right, we're like this. Our hearts are open, and the pain of the other motivates us through love, out of love, for the sake of love, to act. To be clear, I'm not talking about romantic love. It's nice. But I'm talking about something more dependable, something more muscle-bound. I'm talking about a love grounded in mutual responsibility and respect. Love as command, as moral obligation. This is the primary meaning of the word ahava, love, in the Hebrew Bible. Like the commandments to love your neighbor as yourself and to love the stranger. According to Jewish tradition, loving your neighbor or the stranger means minimally caring for their basic needs like food, clothing, and shelter, and more broadly, their dignity. We've come a long way from Kevin and Edward's wedding to a biblically based understanding of the vulnerable, and then a spiritually grounded form of social advocacy. And there's just one more teaching I want to share with you, partly because I can't help myself, and partly because I think his work, his teaching sums up the reason why we're put on this planet to be the hands and feet of God. You know we're the hands and feet of God. You know that. Because God doesn't feed the hungry except through our hands. God does not clothe the naked except through our hands. Right? I want to see your hands. Hands of God. So this teaching is from Emmanuel Levinas. He's a French philosopher. He survived the Holocaust, ended up in France, and there he became a famous philosopher in both the secular and the religious world. And his essential teaching is what he calls the revelation of the face. Everything you need to know about God, he teaches, can be seen in the face of another human being. In fact, he defines God as one's response to the other, the stranger, the vulnerable, the human, which is infinite. Thank you.